Ukraine update, day 778. A Russian strike. Good evening and welcome to Scotland at 7. My name is Ben Francis and I'm joined today by regular guest William Duguid. So, for the Ukraine update. Ukraine update.
Hello.
Alright, hey.
Right, over to you, Ben.
Excuse
Have
me?
I gone quiet?
No. Fine, I can hear you.
Okay. Oh, good.
Okay, yeah, so time for our Ukraine update. A Russian strike on a grocery store and a pharmacy in the northeast Kharkiv region killed 3 people, including a 14-year-old girl, on Wednesday. In Ukraine's southern Odessa region, Russian missiles killed 4 people, including a girl aged 10, and injured 7 more. The governor, Oleg Kibber, said on Telegram. Ukraine's energy ministry said the 2 facilities in south had been targeted in strikes during the night, causing power outages in 2 regions. In Russia, a Ukrainian drone attack on Wednesday killed 3 people in the Kursk border region, the local governor has said. Blasts were reported in Ukraine's northeastern, southern, and western regions on Thursday morning. Explosions were heard in the city of Kharkiv. Its mayor, Ihor Terekov, said the Kharkiv attacks left more than 200,000 customers without power. Oleksiy Kubala, the deputy head of the Ukrainian president's office, said there were also blasts in the Zaporizhia region. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called for more air defense supplies today after Russia used more than 40 missiles and 40 drones to deal damage to the country's critical infrastructure, including substations and power generating facilities in 5 regions. The top US general in Europe has told Congress Ukraine will be outgunned 10-1 by Russia within a matter of weeks if ammunition and weapons are not sent to Kiev soon. On Wednesday, President Biden urged the US House of Representatives to vote immediately on the $60 billion Ukraine bill. Russia's foreign ministry has criticized plans to hold a Ukraine peace conference in Switzerland as being motivated by elections in the US. The conference is to be held on the 15th and 16th of June, and Swiss media have said Joe Biden is expected to be in attendance. Ukrainian politicians have sparked anger by scrapping a clause in a draft law that would have given soldiers serving for more than 36 months the possibility to be discharged. The clause was removed ahead of its second reading after pressure from the Ukrainian military. The EU Court of Justice has ruled that the European Council had not presented enough evidence to establish that the prominent billionaires Peter Aven and Mikhail Friedman were involved in efforts to quote-unquote undermine or threaten the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine, and has removed sanctions against them. Meanwhile, 8 Nordic and Baltic nations are pushing for more support for Ukraine. The Sweden Foreign Minister Tobias Billström said the country supported, quote, an increased role for NATO in providing security-related assistance to Ukraine. Ukraine and the UK signed a framework agreement to cooperate in the defense and arms production sector, officials said in Kiev, part of a wartime effort to build up Ukraine's domestic weapons industry by working with its allies, like the UK. China vowed not to accept, quote, criticism or pressure over its ties with Russia after Washington warned that it would hold Beijing responsible if Moscow makes gains in Ukraine. So, William, I'm wondering what you make of these recent updates, and do you think that NATO countries such as Sweden advocating for deeper security ties with Ukraine could potentially cause further escalation in the conflict, or do you think it's a necessary evil at this point?
Um, it's a very complicated situation, and I think that there are many things that could set it off. But at the minute, we seem to be in a situation where Ukraine definitely has deficiencies in terms of equipment, and also I think in terms of manpower. Something I think they're beginning to look at to try and find a way of increasing their manpower. But in terms of the equipment that they can use in the war to defend themselves, particularly against the Russian-guided missiles that are coming in now from really quite far back, with a range of, I think, something like 45 to 60 kilometers, and therefore being able to fire those without really being touched by Ukraine. Ukraine really need to be able to defend themselves in some way against that. So I think it is important that Ukraine gets some support, some increased support from NATO. That could lead to escalation. It's possible. Putin is very, very good at saber rattling in that regard, but I think it becomes existential after a while, because right now it seems as if Ukraine is going backwards in the war, and I think something needs to change in order to fix that. Always in the background, and mentioned again, is China, which is watching this on a geopolitical basis, and it'll be very interesting to see in the next 6 months how China deals with the situation, because as their influence increases in the world, that in itself makes the whole geopolitical situation much more interesting, as obviously Russia are in there, but the US will not be happy particularly with that. So, as I say, always in a war, a messy and complex situation. And yeah, we just have to keep our fingers crossed that it and the other conflicts in the world, which no doubt we'll be discussing, we find a way to resolution with them before any more greater harm is done.
Okay, yeah. So, yeah, that brings us quite nicely to the next section, which is the Israel and Gaza latest update. So, at least 33,500 Palestinians have been killed and 76,094 injured in Israel's military offensive on Gaza since 7th of October, the Gaza Health Ministry said in a statement on Thursday. President Biden has vowed that US commitment to defend Israel against Iran was quote-unquote ironclad. The US Secretary of State Antony Blinken has also made clear that the US will stand with Israel against any threats from Iran. Iranian threats to carry out a missile strike against Israel are, quote, unacceptable, Rishi Sunak said, as he reaffirmed the UK support for Tel Aviv's right to defend itself. German Foreign Minister Annalena Baerbock called for her Iranian counterpart to urge, quote, maximum restraint to avoid further escalation. While Russia's foreign minister today advised against travel to the Middle East, and German airline Lufthansa extended a suspension of its flights to Tehran, and that the region was kept on edge by Iran's threat to relitigate against Israel for an attack on its embassy in Syria. The US Middle East envoy Brett McGurk is reported to have called the foreign ministers of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar, and Iraq, asking them to deliver a message to Tehran to lower tensions with Israel. A video has surfaced of a senior official at Israel's Cyber Intelligence Agency Unit 8200 talking last year about the use of machine learning, quote, magic powder to help identify Hamas targets in Gaza. The footage raises questions about the accuracy of a recent statement about the use of artificial intelligence, AI, by the Israeli Defense Force, which says it, quote, does not use an artificial intelligence system that identifies terrorist operatives or tries to predict whether a person is a terrorist. Israeli forces killed 3 sons of Hamas leader Ismail Haniyeh in an airstrike in Gaza without consulting senior commanders or political leaders, including Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli media reports said today. Haniyeh said the Israeli attacks that killed 3 of his sons and at least 2 grandchildren would not change Hamas's demands for a permanent ceasefire and return of the displaced Palestinians from their homes in ongoing negotiations mediated by Doha and Washington. Israel's foreign minister today denounced Ireland's new Prime Minister, Simon Harris, for not mentioning the hostages held by militants in Gaza during a speech to the Irish Parliament about the conflict. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said Israel is continuing its war in Gaza, but is also preparing for scenarios in other areas. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov today called for all countries in the Middle East to show restraint and prevent the region from slipping into chaos. The Israeli Defense Force, IDF, said it had struck a building used by Hezbollah in southern Lebanon, reported to the Times of Israel today. The UN Deputy Secretary General, Amin J. Mohammed, said that, quote, humanity and the, quote, international community has lost its moral compass on Gaza. The United Nations Agency for Palestinian Refugees, UNRWA, has been awarded a Spanish civil order of chivalry and honored by the King of Spain. So, William, I'm wondering what you make of the recent developments in the conflict, especially in regard to the growing tension between Iran and Israel. Do you think there's a risk that that conflict could potentially heat up between those two nations? And do you think, due to the UK's strong support for Israel, that could have the risk of us, our nation, being dragged into that conflict?
I think this is the period of maximum danger that we've always thought might be a prospect for the conflict to break out more widely in the Middle East. And Israel, I assume it was Israel's attack on the Iranian embassy in Syria, will not go unanswered. And Iran has said that that will definitely be the case. And the question is, what sort of reaction will it provoke? And it's interesting to see the various players playing their roles, and all the imploring of Iran to exercise restraint coming from Germany, coming from America through intermediaries in Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates and Qatar and Iraq, and indeed Russia saying to all parties, please just caw canny a wee bit here, because it does have the potential to really cause quite a bit of chaos, and that genie isn't at all easy to put back into the bottle. And yeah, the ominous phrase that Israel is continuing the war in Gaza, albeit with a bit of a lull. Of course, there has been a partial withdrawal, either while they prepare for the onslaught on Rafah, or more likely just keep things in reserve in case things do go south very quickly, with the whole region going up in some sort of conflict pyre. That too is a bit of an ominous development. So yeah, these are troubled times, and it's very, very difficult to know what Iran will actually do. What we do know is that there will be something, and yes, if we and if the US are seen as major supporters of Israel, which is very difficult to deny, bearing in mind the statements from both governments, even if Joe Biden is getting increasingly testy with Israel, then it could well lead to problems of terrorism or of another sort on UK or US soil, or in an extreme, it could end with both the US and the UK being dragged into the war, and that would not be a good thing at all. So we must hope that cooler heads prevail, but it's a tense time.
Yeah, that's true. That's definitely a valid risk you bring up of terrorism. I hadn't thought of that, but yeah. I mean, Al Qaeda did state that, it's like Israel and US support for it was part of why they did what they did in their, terrorist actions. So yeah, it's a good point to bring up. So on to the next story. Reports say new import controls will cost the UK businesses £2 billion and fuel inflation. New post-Brexit UK border controls coming into force later this month will cost UK businesses £2 billion and higher fuel inflation, according to a report warning that UK-EU trade will be damaged as a result. With less than a month before the introduction of these new checks on animal and plant products from 30th of April, the insurer Allianz Trade said the controls agreed under Boris Johnson's Brexit deal could add 10% to import costs over the first year. Ministers last week revealed that businesses could be charged up to £145 for each consignment imported through Dover, prompting warnings that this would drive up food prices and disproportionately hurt small businesses. The Allianz report said that the checks, part of the government's Border Target Operating Model, BTOM, would affect 21 billion of the agricultural product imports, including eggs, live trees, and plants, meat and fish, covering about 3% of all UK imports. These new costs were equivalent to adding a 10% tariff on these imports, it said, with Allianz indicating that EU companies would be likely to pass on these costs to UK consumers. Commenting, the SNP's Europe and EU Ascension spokesperson, Alan Smith MP, said, quote, with the Labour and the Tories both committed to Brexit, independence and the only way for Scotland to rejoin the EU single market and customs union to stop the onslaught of Brexit. Quote, Brexit has been a disaster from the beginning, with businesses and household budgets in Scotland paying the price for Brexit and Tory government policies, none of which we voted for. Every week, we see further evidence that Brexit isn't working. Indeed, it is actively damaging businesses and our economy. But Sir Keir Starmer has made it clear that things won't change under a UK Labour government. So, William, I was just wondering, what's your take on this, and how much do you think the current economic woes we're seeing right now, more generally, are because of trade barriers like this as a result of Brexit? Do you think it's a large section of that, or is because of the Brexit deal?
Yes, I think that the economic woes we've been suffering are for a number of factors, but Brexit is certainly in there and isn't given the attention it deserves by some of our main politicians who may secretly regret the deal that was made, but certainly aren't showing any signs of it feeding through into policy anytime soon. And that applies to both the Conservatives and the Labour Party, who are quite likely to be in power this time next year, but will still be stuck in the same endless loop. Um, I think that the effects of Brexit weren't all seen at once, and many of the import controls have been introduced gradually and have been staved off for as long as it's possible to stave them off. But with the ones coming in on April 30th, we do see a little bit of impact on food inflation, and we also see some barriers on just the cost of doing business being a barrier in itself. The actual effect on food inflation over a 3-year period is said to be something like 0.2%. So it's not absolutely massive in itself. It's only when you add it to all the other things that we've seen so far that it becomes significant. And there are some other things going on, such as the suspension of some other tariffs, which may actually help to reduce headline inflation in the next few months. But the problems are kind of baked in. For Scotland, the problem of rejoining the EU becomes more of a problem the more we differentiate, the more that the EU passes legislation and standards and things like that, and the UK doesn't catch up. So Scotland doesn't catch up while it's in the UK. And then Scotland has to make up that ground when getting connected to the EU again, should it become independent. And the the barriers to exporters are another whole kettle of fish in that regard, because that's where standards really matter. And the UK standards are not keeping pace with the EU's. There's been quite a raft of legislation currently going through the EU that will enhance their standards and make it harder for our exporters to stay in the game. So it's bad news all round and always has been. And where Alan Smith is quite right, we've got a long, long way to go till we can really start to sort out the contribution to our economic problems that Brexit has created.
So, do you see like the SNP's solution of independence and then leaving the EU as the best solution to like these trade problems that we're talking about?
I think it's essential that Scotland, at the very least, gets a foothold in the single market again and back to tariff-free trade with the EU. That could be done, I think, in the early days of independence through what the EU calls an associate membership scheme, which is nations wishing to join. And that would pretty well get you back in the single market fairly quickly, and I'm saying within sort of 1 or 2 years. EU membership itself would take longer. There are other solutions upon independence that are cited by some parties, such as joining EFTA. It's quite complicated in a news bulletin like this to go through the sort of differences between them. But I would say an associate membership would be the best thing, and that will only come in the short term anyway through independence. The UK, I think, may eventually be dragged kicking and screaming back to the EU, but it ain't going to happen soon. And the longer this goes on, the harder things get.
And do you think there's a will among the Scottish people to basically go through two more referendums after the two they went through before? Do you think that's like a viable pitch from political parties?
Well, referendums are not popular with the UK right at the moment. Um, I think there are quite a lot of Scottish people are looking for some mechanism which would allow them to pass judgment on what they want to do with their future. And that may be a referendum, although that's been ruled out by the Supreme Court and certainly keeps getting ruled out by Westminster politicians. But there may be other things, such as elections coming up, both Westminster and Holyrood in 2026, which may allow the Scottish people to pass judgment on what they want, particularly in 2026, if they give power to either the SNP or to the SNP and other pro-independence parties in coalition. So it may not necessarily be a referendum, but I do think there's a hunger for the polarisation and all the difficulties of the last few years to be resolved and for a decision to be made with which we can all be happy and actually move forward with Scotland rather than being stuck where we are.
Okay, yeah, that's interesting. So, to our next story, the Bank of England MPC members say the UK interest rates need to stay higher for longer. Cuts in the UK interest rate should to be, quote, a way off, according to a Bank of England policymaker who has said that inflationary pressures will keep the cost of borrowing higher than financial market than financial markets expect. Megan Green, a member of the bank's 9-member Monetary Policy Committee, MPC, which sets interest rates, said financial markets were betting, quote, in the wrong direction when they judged how quickly the central bank would make its first rate cut. A bigger than expected increase in US inflation in March to 3.5% surprised markets on Wednesday, pushing back expectations for the first Federal Reserve rate cut to September. Green said the markets expected the Fed and the Bank of England to reduce interest rates in tandem when the dynamics of the two economies were very different. Financial markets are betting that the first reduction in UK interest rates from 5.3% will be in August, and that there will be at least one further cut this year. The Consumer Price Index measure of inflation has fallen steeply in recent months to 3.4%, raising the prospect that it could drop below the Bank of England target of 2% as early as May. The next policy decision by the MPC is due on 9th of May. On Monday, the International Monetary Fund had warned the Bank of England that the high proportion of UK homeowners on fixed-rate mortgages means that they should be wary of keeping interest rates too high for too long. So, I'm just wondering, William, what do you think of that story? And do you think interest rates should be raised, lowered, or should remain more same?
I'm one of those who believes that you don't keep interest rates too high for longer than you need to. And the IMF makes the point about people on fixed rate mortgages, and that has two sort of sides to it. One is that because people are on fixed rate mortgages, you don't necessarily see the effect of high interest rates for quite a while. It takes quite a while for them to work through into the system, which means that you may or may not perceive that, well, nothing's happening, we'd better keep them high. But in fact, the effect is going to happen. It just hasn't fed through into the system yet. So there is a danger in that. But the other side of it is that when people who are on fixed rate mortgages come to the end of their period when the rate is fixed, then they suddenly find a great hike in the amount that they're paying. And that can cause immense pain and indeed does not benefit the economy, because now there's a whole bunch of money being taken out of the economy that these people would otherwise spend. So high interest rates for an overlong period tend to benefit perhaps the 20% richest, who are earning nice interest and both savings rates and investment rates on it, but tend to penalise those who are the least well off. So I think it's arguable. Um, Nobody has a crystal ball, but I think it's arguable that the period of high inflation that we've just witnessed has come to a natural end. It was caused to a great extent by external factors, and it's on the way out. Yes, I acknowledge that the US figure announced last week came as a surprise, but I think the general trend is still down. And because of that, I think it would be unwise. I'm not an economist, but I do believe it would be unwise to keep interest rates artificially high on the basis that there are still, quote, inflationary pressures in the system, when in fact there may well not be. So um, I don't think I would win any prizes for orthodox economics, but maybe I'd be quite glad of that.
Yeah. Well, to the next story, Buckingham Palace official demanded assurance king could not be prosecuted under new Welsh agricultural law. Royal courtiers privately put pressure on the Welsh government to ensure that King Charles could not be prosecuted for rural crimes under a new law that ministers had drawn up, documents revealed. The Welsh government's chief legislator, who is an elected politician, was, quote, not happy that the king was to be given the special exemption from prosecution, but agreed to it last year. A Buckingham Palace official phoned the Welsh government to secure the assurance under an anarchic custom that requires UK parliamentarians to obtain the consent of the monarch for draft bills before they can be implemented. Under the mechanism, ministers notify the royal family of specific clauses in draft law that may affect their personal wealth, their private property, or their public functions. The ministers ask the monarch to approve the laws before they can be passed. The use of the consent mechanism has been criticised as, quote, undemocratic, as it has been in force in Westminster since the 1700s and has been extended to the Scottish and Welsh parliaments. During the Queen's 70-year reign, she vetted more than 1,000 draft laws before they were approved by elected politicians. Those included bills that affected her personal property, such as her privately owned estate in Balmoral. The mechanisms had continued seamlessly into the reign of Charles. Ministers in Westminster, Scotland, and Wales have been required to obtain his consent to 20 laws since he came to the throne back in September 2022. Buckingham Palace refused to say whether the king had asked for any changes to these laws before approving them. One was a bill that was formulated by the Welsh government to reform agricultural practices. In last year's Agriculture Wales Act, the monarch was exempted from regulations relating to the marketing of agricultural products, the disposal of carcasses, and the disclosure of information to the Welsh state. Police are also unable to gain automatic entry to the king's private property portfolio under part of the act. So, William, I'm just wondering, what do you think the fact that an unelected head of state has the power to effectively vet laws which are passed by elected parliamentarians? What do you think that says about the state of democracy in the United Kingdom? Do you think that's a problem?
I think it is profoundly undemocratic, and I would like to see it end. I think that the royal family should be subject to the same laws in the same way as the rest of us are, just as simple as that. And it is disturbing to see royal courtiers ringing up the democratically elected Welsh government to, if you like, plead on the king's behalf that these laws should not affect him. And we've seen the same in Scotland too, where part of, I think, the Balmoral estate was exempted from carbon reduction legislation. And, that's something that's important for all of us. And we should all of us share in what needs to be done to fix it. And therefore, it was not fair that the Queen, as she then was, should be exempt from that. So, yeah, bit of a Republican on this one, I'm afraid. It is anti-democratic, and it should come to an end, even if it has been going for over 300 years.
And do you see any hope of Charles reforming this? Because obviously some sections of politics have seen him as more of a reforming monarch, or do you think like that's unlikely and the only way to abolish this kind of practice is just to abolish the monarchy itself?
Well, that would have to come, I think, with the consent of the people. I'm not sure. I would. I mean, I would personally probably be quite glad for the monarchy to be abolished, but others might not be. I don't think Charles will have reform of this sort of thing high on his agenda at the moment, because he has obviously personal health things on his agenda, and he has much else going on in the royal family also on his agenda. But I think it's possible that his successors may look at it, particularly if they have um, uh, the prospect of a fairly long reign, because I think it will not be fixed quickly. But I think there might be hope in the future, but not right now.
Yeah, okay. So on to the next story. Former post office MD apologizes for celebrating pregnant operator's conviction. A former post office executive has apologized for sending an email saying the conviction of a pregnant branch owner operator who was subsequently jailed and then exonerated was, quote, brilliant news. The inquiry into the Horizon IT scandal heard that David Smith, who was managing director of the post office for 7 months during 2010, sent the email to his team after he heard that Seema Mirza had been convicted. She was later sentenced to 15 months in prison for theft and locked up on her son's 10th birthday while 8 weeks pregnant. She was put on suicide watch after collapsing in court. Her conviction was among those overruled by the Court of Appeals in 2021. The inquiry is looking into the wrongful prosecution of hundreds of post office operators who were hounded for more than a decade because of shortfalls in their branch accounts that were due to bugs in the post office's Horizon IT system. It was told today that Smith sent the email on 21st of October 2010 saying, quote, brilliant news, well done, please pass my thanks on to the team. He said the message was intended to be a congratulatory email to the team, knowing that they'd worked hard on the case, and because he thought it was, quote, brilliant, the Horizon IT system was seen to be robust at the prosecution of Misra, which was regarded as a, quote, test case. Smith told the hearing that his email wording was, quote, really poorly thought through, and I do apologize to Misra, as the email had caused her and her family, quote, substantial upset. So, William, what do you make of the whole scandal, and who do you think, if anybody, should be held accountable for this? Because obviously it's an IT glitch, so, that makes it a bit more of a difficult question.
Yes, well, the post office scandal is in everybody's mind at the moment and has been since the start of the year. It's clearly one of the biggest miscarriages of justice the UK has ever seen. And it shows no sign of getting any better, because we're hearing all sorts of things now in the inquiry about how really attitudes within the post office were that the system was infallible and that they were infallible, and that somehow a huge number of employees had suddenly become crooked and needed to be sorted out and taken through the courts and imprisoned. And that caused immense damage to them, to their families, and in some cases, um, people died without ever being exonerated. People died because of what happened to them, and it's a dreadful state of affairs. As for David Smith, well, he exhibited one of the bad attitudes I've just referred to. He was head for about 7 months in 2010. At that time, I don't think he was party to any knowledge that the Horizon system was anything other than infallible. So he's got that excuse, if you like. But even assuming that Seema Misra had been guilty, which she was most definitely not, but if she had been, for him to exult in quite those terms that a pregnant woman had been sent to jail, put on suicide watch, uh, it's just over the top and unacceptable. Congratulations to the team on a fine job is fine, but to say that that sort of thing befalling anybody is brilliant news is really not a good thing at all. And this attitude seems to have gone through the post office like a stick of rock, and it's now being revealed for everybody to see as the inquiry goes on. And I do hope that justice is done, and that justice includes, not necessarily in David Smith's case, but possibly in some others. I think prosecutions for the post office management of the day, for perversion of the course of justice, and other things. And I very much hope, I can't be sure because this is the UK and bad things don't necessarily get resolved quickly in the UK, but I very much hope that actually happens at some point.
Yeah, well, definitely would be good to have some accountability in a situation like that for sure. Yeah. So, on to the next story. UN experts urge the Gambia not to decriminalize female genital mutilation. A team of UN experts had urged Gambian lawmakers not to repeal a ban on female genital mutilation, saying such a move would set a dangerous global precedent. In a letter dated 8th of April and made public today, the experts, led by Reem Al-Salam, the UN Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women and Girls, said allowing the unchecked return of, quote, one of the most pernicious forms of violence committed against women and children would violate their right to freedom from torture. Mama Fatima Segelta, who was the Gambian justice minister when the law banning female genital mutilation was passed in 2015, and is now special rapporteur on the sale, sexual exploitation, and sexual abuse of children, was also one of the four signees. Gambian lawmakers had backed an amendment to the law banning female genital mutilation in a second round vote on 18th of March. Amen Gibba, the legislator who sponsored the new bill, said he did so to, quote, uphold religious loyalty and safeguard cultural norms and values, end quote, in the Muslim majority state. The Gambia banned FGM in 2015 in a law that makes the practice punishable by up to 3 years in prison or 50,000 dalices, equivalent £586 in fines. It was the outcome of years of lobbying by rights groups within and beyond the country, with some of them led by female genital mutilation survivors. About half of the West African country's 2.7 million people are women. Many of them have either had to go through the practice or have had relatives who have done so. UN estimates say that there could be as high as 3/4 of all women between 18 and 49 in the country could be victims. The law came as a relief to girls and women. It was widely hailed by the international community as a sign of progress and an example for other countries to follow. But it was unpopular in some of the religious groups in the Gambia who have since campaigned for a ban or for the ban on female genital mutilation to be overturned. So, William, I'm wondering, how likely do you think it is that the ban will be overturned? And if it is overturned, do you think it could spread to more countries in the region? Like, would it be a dangerous precedent?
I don't know how likely it is. It's depressing to see so soon uh, a law that was actually uh, doing good for women and girls who have to suffer some awful things potentially otherwise. For that law, really fairly early on. I mean, although it was passed in 2015, I think the first actual prosecution under it came last year, and there was a fine, but not as much as the maximum, and there was no prison sentence. But that in itself was enough to trigger the more conservative elements of Gambian society, who had been against that law being passed in the first place, to mobilize and start the campaign to have it repealed. And the fact now that UN figures, UN experts, and the Special Rapporteur and others have had to intervene to say that, look, girls have a right to freedom from torture. This is one of the most pernicious forms of violence committed against women and children. Is significant because it does suggest, I would say, that the bill has a fair chance of being overturned, and that would be a terrible thing. And yes, it would have a severe impact, I think, on the ongoing campaign to um, against practices like this elsewhere in Africa and elsewhere in the world. It would do no good at all. So we must hope that common sense prevails and that cultural norms do not, or perceived cultural norms do not come out against justice and freedom from torture for women. But who knows in this world as it is today?
Yeah. Well, to move on to the next story, Polish MPs debate easing strict abortion rules. Poland's parliament has begun a long-awaited debate on loosening the country's near-total ban on abortion in what campaigners have described as a crucial test of the country's new coalition government. More than 3 years after hundreds of thousands of people poured onto the streets, wielding placards that read, quote, "The revolution has a uterus" and, quote, "My body, my choice," MPs are considering four proposals today. Two of the bills are aimed at legalizing abortion up to the 12th week of pregnancy, and another is focused on decriminalization. The fourth, introduced by the conservative Third Way Alliance, seeks a return to the strict 1993 laws hammered out between political leaders and the Catholic Church, which were tightened in 2020 by the Law and Justice Party. The debate is expected to last hours, and MPs are due to vote on Friday on whether to send the bill to a special commission for further study. So, William, I'm wondering, I don't know how much you know about the specifics of Polish politics, but how likely do you think it is that the new coalition government will manage to reverse Law and Justice's abortion policies?
Well, there's a fair chance they might, but this is seen particularly as a big test for Donald Tusk's ruling coalition, which is quite far flung, and consequently, it's not by any means certain how they will look at this. Again, it's depressing to see sort of going back to well, this isn't actually going back to anything, to be fair, but it's depressing to see the general trend that's going on in the world, including in the USA, I might add, against the rights of women right now. And admittedly, all four of the pieces of legislation that are up there are making things better than they are now, because the tightening of the abortion laws in 2020 was a real problem, because it barred abortion in the case of fetal abnormalities, and I believe that there were 6 women who died because some surgeons chose to prioritize the fetuses over them, just either through ideology or because they were afraid of legal challenge, and that sort of ironclad tightness should not be in the legislation. So even the Third Way Alliance are looking to push things back to 1993, which was in itself nowhere near liberal enough. I think it will be a very interesting vote tomorrow, and I would hope that, again, enlightenment would prevail. That's what the Polish people thought they had elected the government to do, although it is a very polarizing issue within Poland, and anything could happen.
So, do you have any idea, or what's your thoughts on how the more conservative Third Way Party in the coalition will vote on the bill? Do you think it's likely that they will change the laws back to how they were in 1993, or do you think some of them might, because of pressure from their more conservative voters, stop the legislation from passing at all?
I don't know very much about the Third Way, but my understanding is it's the Third Way Alliance, part of the coalition, who has proposed going back to 1993. So I don't think they'll stick with a hardline 2020. I think that will be their compromise position. So I would expect that they would vote for going back to 1993. But the big question is, what will everybody else vote for? Will they vote for one of the far more liberal bills, the two that are allowing abortion up to the 12th week of pregnancy, which is itself far more illiberal than we have in much of the rest of the world, including the UK, or even just on decriminalisation? And the answer is, I simply don't know.
Yeah, well, we'll find out with the vote, I guess. But yeah, I'm sure it'll end up a lot more liberal in the situation now. I'm sure the coalition now will have a more liberal outcome than the Law and Justice government beforehand. But yeah, you're right. The details will be, yeah, we'll find out the details when they happen, when the vote happens. But on to the next story. Biden commits billions to climate action ahead of election. With rising global temperatures and the oncoming presidential election against an opponent who has indicated he will gut his climate policies, President Biden is investing billions of dollars into efforts he hopes will spur enduring cuts to planet heating emissions, no matter the occupant of the White House next January. In recent weeks, the administration has brought forward a slate of large funding announcements to help drive down carbon pollution, with projects involving of everything from the advent of zero emissions concrete to low pollution food production, including mac and cheese and ice cream, to driving the uptake of solar panels and electric stoves in low income households. The spending is the most significant yet to come via the Inflation Reduction Act, IRA, Biden's signature climate bill. However, the new funding goes beyond the short-term politicking that has haunted the US's ponderous response to the climate crisis until now. Last week, $20 billion was awarded under the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a mechanism set up by the IRA, to nonprofit groups that will provide low-interest loans for clean energy projects, such as installing solar panels on community centers or heat pumps, and introduction stoves in households that couldn't otherwise afford them. The Environmental Protection Agency, EPA, predicts that the private sector will increase the overall funding sevenfold to about $150 billion, accelerating the replacement of polluting appliances with cleaner versions, greening public transit, and boosting renewable energy going to the grid, particularly in low-income neighborhoods. Industrial processes contribute about a quarter of all planet heating emissions in the US, but the sector has been considered difficult to green, unlike other areas, as the electrification of cars or the adding of solar and wind to the power grid. High heat activities, such as creating steel or concrete, are still reliant on fossil fuels, but the Biden administration has said that this can be reversed via $6 billion in a new spending on cutting-edge technologies. Jennifer Granholm, the U.S. Energy Secretary, has said the 33 funded projects represent, quote, the single largest industrial decarbonization investment in American history. The projects include a new aluminum casting plant in West Virginia that will run on hydrogen rather than gas, the first of its kind. 6 different projects will create zero-emission or low-emission cement, the key ingredient of concrete. Kraft Heinz, the food manufacturer, will get $170 million to install electric boilers and heat pumps at its facilities to create, among other things, pasta without fossil fuels. Unilever will get up to $20 million to decarbonize its production of ice cream. So, what do you make of this new action by Biden's government? And I guess maybe like a bit in a bit of a bigger scale, like what do you think of Biden's record on climate change during his presidency? Do you think he's done enough?
Well, he clearly doesn't think he's done enough himself yet, because all this is going on right now. I think everybody's record in climate action has been dreadful, to be honest. All the promises that from COP26 and probably before COP26 onwards have often turned out to be just words without action to back them up. This at least has got some funding going for it. What seems to me to be the story is that Biden is absolutely throwing the kitchen sink at getting the funding in there, because it's quite difficult for a new administration to pull back the funding once it's been committed. And there are some very interesting slices to it. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, the 20 billion, which was the first thing you mentioned, does have a big multiplier effect, and effectively the money is being given to not-for-profit organisations to lend out to or even to have grants for projects that will improve things, and therefore it will ultimately be not $20 billion of funding, but possibly $150 billion or more. And then there's the other ones on top of that, the $6 billion on clean technologies, where you end up getting concrete and aluminium, but also in one area, food is rendered more carbon neutral in its production. So a lot has been put into this. I don't know about its likely its likely progress through the legislative journey it'll be on, but certainly it's an attempt to get everything going and at least something happening before Donald Trump turns up, if indeed he does turn up, because Donald Trump's he will be inclined, yes, to gut any climate policies he can and to reverse what he can, and he's on record, I think, as saying that. So one can see why. One might also obviously surmise that maybe Biden isn't all that certain that Biden himself is going to be elected over Trump, and that there really is a fairly big danger that we'll see another Trump presidency beginning in 2025.
That's a good point I hadn't thought about. Yeah, I guess this action could maybe suggest that Biden's not very confident in his prospects. And yeah, I mean, if the polling is anything to be believed, you can see why, I guess.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, unless Trump goes to jail, I guess. But we'll see if that happens. There's been a lot of people predicting that for years at this point. So, well, but you never know. Find out. But
yeah.
But anyway, on to our last story. The Scottish Government to introduce new Scottish pub code. The Scottish Government is taking action to improve the rights of tied pub tenants across the country. A new Scottish pub code will enable eligible tied pub tenants to sell a guest beer from brands that have small production levels or switch to a market rate lease under which they could purchase products from any supplier. Ministers will lay secondary legislation in next week, which, if approved, would see the code come into force on 7th October 2024. It will be overseen by an adjudicator who is expected to be appointed next month, subject to parliamentary approval. The introduction of secondary legislation followed the conclusion of unsuccessful legal challenges to the Tied Pubs Scotland Act 2021, brought by some pub-owning businesses, which culminated in a decision by the Supreme Court last month not to hear their appeal. A tied lease involves tenants buying some or all of their alcohol and other products and services from the pub-owning business. Ministers expect the legislation will deliver a fairer tied pub sector, with risks and rewards being equally shared between tenants and their landlords. In 2023, it was estimated that there were just under 700 tied pubs in Scotland. Small Business Minister Richard Lochhead said, quote, "I am pleased that we are now free to introduce measures contained in the Tied Pubs Act and give tenants more freedom to choose the lease which best suits their needs and diversify the number of products they can sell." So, William, what do you make of this change in legislation?
Well, it's being seen as a lifeline for small pub businesses by giving them more freedom from the sometimes quite restrictive regime they were in as tied tenants, and perhaps some of the things that the large pub owning groups were doing to them. It's pretty much, I think, bringing the Scottish licensing trade into line with England in many regards, which is, I think, a good thing in this case because England was ahead. it's been hailed by the Scottish Licensed Trade Association and by CAMRA and others as a game changer. But of course, no surprise that the Scottish Beer and Pub Association, which represents the owners, is not so keen on it. And it was members of that group, principally, I think, Green King, who were putting a legal challenge to this into the court that the Supreme Court decided not to hear. And I think the licensees will be quite pleased to hear that we've moved on from that now, and that this maybe is, assuming it all goes smoothly up till October, going to provide a bit of a helping hand to a sector that really hasn't had an easy time since COVID. And so I think we should raise a glass to them and hope for the best.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, bars and pubs certainly haven't had a good time since COVID. That's true. I'm sure they can use all the help they can from the Scottish government at this point. I can only imagine what it'd be like to be an owner for the last 5 years. Well, that is all we have time for this evening. But before I go, I just want to remind you that at Broadcasting Scotland, we depend on the generosity of our supporters. Our programmes will always be free to view. However, if you can afford £5 a month, please consider becoming a Broadcasting Scotland supporter. To everyone who has donated and everyone who has signed up to make a regular monthly payment, thank you very much. Our focus must now move to securing the future of independent broadcasting for Scotland by growing our subscriber base and regular funding. So thank you again to our guest William. Goodbye and thank you for watching.